Good morning and hello, class. So today we will be covering our second lecture, our evolution of populations, part 2. In other words, we're going to look at now what causes microevolution. What is the cause of variation? What is the cause of this microevolution of populations changing over time? So hopefully you guys have your note outline out. You guys could fill it in as I go through these slides if you don't already have them filled in. So first thing we have to do is remember populations evolve. That is the smallest scale of evolution. Remember, natural selection can act on individuals. Some individuals can have better reproductive success, better differential survival. That's our survival of the fittest. You know, some individuals are going to be able to survive better than others, and they get to reproduce and reproduce better. But remember, the entire population will end up kind of evolving. It's not just that individual. That individual can't just leave. No, it's going to have to eventually start mating with the population and starting to slowly change that population, have that entire population evolve. So once again, populations evolve. The genetic makeup of a population will change over time. Genotype frequencies, allele frequencies will change over time. More favorable traits are going to become those that have greater fitness are going to become more common or start to increase in their frequency and their percentage of that population. And guys, we see examples of microevolution all the time. Guys, some people, it's like, well, we don't see it in action. No, we see natural selection in action. We see it with pesticides. You know, these ranchers, these farmers that spray their crops with huge amounts of pesticide, you know, they're effective. They kill like 99.9% of the pests, but there's a couple that survive. There might be 2 or 3 out of those, maybe 100,000 that are out there that maybe have, just because of some random mutation, they have a difference in their DNA, a difference in their protein that the pesticide maybe doesn't bond to, so it doesn't affect them. They get to survive. And what do they get to do? They get to reproduce and pass it down. And slowly, this population changes over time, where now there's going to be a higher frequency of these pests that are resistant to this pesticide, this insecticide. And it's, you know, it takes a couple of generations, but after 3 or 4 years, most of this population of pests will end up now being resistant. That's why farmers, ranchers have to kind of just constantly be changing. Every 3 or 4 years, they have to change their pesticide because those pests become resistant. And once again, we see it once again all over pocket mice. Pocket mice are these species of mice that where you have kind of like a desert or a beach kind of running into a lava flow, where it's kind of split the population. You know, some have more darker fur or darker hair that kind of helps them blend in with the lava rock, and then others have more lighter fur color that helps them blend in with the actual beach or the desert-like environment. And this is a good example of how natural selection has kind of actually selected for these two differences in these species of pocket mice. And we have other examples, and here you see them. But guys, once again, individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. Individuals can either survive or they don't survive. Individuals will be selected for, but once again, populations will evolve. That's our smallest scale of evolution. And guys, here, notice here we have a chart kind of showing how what individuals are being selected and how our population kind of gets selected for as well. Notice we have percent of births in population right here in blue. And then here we have birth weight in pounds. And then we have this red line that kind of shows us our percent infant mortality. And notice it looks like natural selection, it looks like the environment, when it comes to humans at least, selects for what kind of birth weight, like which birth weight do individuals survive really well. And notice it's right around anywhere from like, you know, 6 to 8, 9 pounds. You know, they have a high kind of survival. They have a low death rate, infant mortality death rate, and their percent birth is really high. So do you guys remember how much you weighed when you were born? Probably weighed somewhere between you know, possibly 6, 9, maybe 10 pounds. But notice low birth weights, really high, and don't do well. That infant mortality rate tends to increase. Now, one important term we do have to define is fitness. Now, guys, don't get confused. Some people think fitness is, oh, well, it's the strongest. You know, the ones that are the biggest end up surviving. No. When it comes to fitness, evolutionary fitness, it's all about how well you survive, but also how well you reproduce. It's individuals with one phenotype kind of leave more offspring than others. For example, here we have 3 graphs showing a water strider, an insect that can actually sit on the water because water has great surface tension, one of those beast factors that we talked about. Now, notice we have the same x-axis. We have the length, how big the actual water strider is. But this one here is looking at how many eggs it lays per day. This one, how many eggs it lays per its entire lifetime. And this is how long it actually lives. Guys, if you look at these 3 graphs, what size of water strider do you think has the best fitness? So I'll give you a couple seconds to think about this. And notice if you said about 14 millimeters, that would be it. Because notice at 14 millimeters, they actually live a decent amount of time. Notice it's not the highest, but it's decent. But notice that's when they actually lay the highest amount of eggs in their entire lifetime. 14 millimeter water striders lay the most eggs in their entire lifetime. And eggs per day, pretty decent as well. Notice what happens. If you're too small, you live actually a good amount of time, but you don't really lay a lot of eggs in your lifetime. You don't really lay a lot of eggs in the, during the day, laid per day. And notice what happens if you're a really big water strider, you don't live very long. It looks like maybe being bigger, you get picked off a lot easier. Notice you don't lay as many eggs in your lifetime because you don't survive as long. You do lay a lot per day, but once again, you get compromised here in your lifetime, your lifespan as well. So 14 millimeters here would be the greatest fitness when it comes to water striders. Now, let's look at what we call variation and natural selection. Guys, variation is the raw material for natural selection. Guys, natural selection cannot work if there's no variation. And guys, once again, variation is just the differences we see in a population. And guys, this is something Darwin noticed whenever he studied any kind of population in his travels, like a population of iguanas, turtles, dolphins, finches. He always noticed variations. There are always differences in a population. So there has to be differences within the population. Some individuals are going to be more fit than others. Now, where does all this variation come from? Where do all these differences we see come from? Well, guys, it comes from mutations, random changes to our DNA. It could be errors in mitosis or meiosis. It could be environmental damage. But once again, mutation will cause all these variations that we see. And then we have sex that ends up mixing these alleles, mating with individuals or mutations with these differences start to mix these alleles and possibly cause them to become more frequent or less frequent depending what natural selection is doing. So recombination of alleles, that's part of the sex right there. So once again, new arrangements in every offspring, new combinations gives rise to possibly new phenotypes. It spreads variation as well. Offsprings will inherit traits from their parents. So all variation comes from mutation, and then that gets spread out by sex, by recombination of these alleles. Now, we're going to look at the 5 major agents that cause evolutionary change, that cause microevolution. And some of these we already discussed. We have mutation, gene flow, which is migration, non-random mating, genetic drift, and selection. So these are the 5 that we're going to look at. These are the 5 kind of biggest things, the 5 agents of evolutionary change, of microevolutionary change. So let's look at the first one, mutation, which we kind of already mentioned. Mutation creates variation. You have point mutations, you have gene duplications. New mutations are always constantly appearing. Now, remember, when you have a mutation, it changes our DNA sequence. Well, if you change the DNA sequence, you're going to now change the amino acid sequence, possibly. If you change the amino acid sequence, now you're changing the actual protein. If you change the protein, now you're changing its structure. If you change the structure, remember in biology, structure dictates function. So now it could have possibly a different function. And maybe that function helps it do something that it couldn't do before. It could possibly be some sort of advantage. So changes in protein may change phenotype and therefore change fitness. Maybe now it has a better chance of survival. Now, gene flow. Guys, gene flow is migration. It's the movement of individuals and alleles in and out of a population. It could be something like just seed or pollen distribution by plants, by wind, by insects. It could be migration of animals, how animals migrate from one area to the next during different seasons. Subpopulations may have different allele frequencies. It could cause genetic mixing across regions. And sometimes gene flow might not be the greatest thing because sometimes it can reduce differences between the populations. For example, when you look at humans, guys, when it comes to humans, thousands and thousands of years ago, we were separated into kind of different subpopulations. We have Asian and we have Indian and we have Black and Hispanic and Caucasian. And for a long time, we were separated, usually by barriers, by geographical barriers. But now we have a lot more mixing of these different subpopulations. We're becoming more homogenized as a population. So when it comes to human evolution today, once again, gene flow in human populations is a lot more, it's increased for sure. Transferring alleles between populations, we have, planes, trains, boats that have now reduced those barriers. And there was an interesting article that came out in Time about, I want to say it's almost like 15 years ago, where scientists kind of published this article talking about how, not anytime soon, but like in 50,000, 100,000 years from now, how we're not going to see a lot of differences when it comes to our skin color anymore, because we have a lot more mixing between these subpopulations, that we're going to become more homogenized, and there'll be kind of almost like one universal kind of skin pigmentation possibly. So they had this kind of article kind of, talking about, are we moving towards kind of this blended world? Very interesting read. I'll see if I could actually put it on Enmodo, so you could read a very interesting information that they give in that article. So once again, that's gene flow. That definitely can cause populations to change over time. Now, another one is non-random mating, what we call sexual selection. Guys, when it comes to mating, especially when it comes to animals, it's not random. There's a lot of sexual selection. There has to be attractiveness to potential mate, fertility of gametes, successful rearing of offspring. All these things are what's being considered when it comes to mating. And usually when it comes to animals, who's doing that choosing? Who's the one who ends up doing the selection? Well, if you guess the female, you are right. Females end up being the ones who end up selecting the actual mate, which actually ends up driving a lot of kind of like very interesting changes in the population when it comes to males. For example, when you look at peacocks, guys, it's the male peacocks that actually have this beautiful kind of feathery display, their coloration. And the reason they have that is because they're trying to attract the female. Female peacocks actually look kind of bland. They don't have the beautiful colors because they don't need to. It's the males that have to kind of show off, be very colorful to try to attract the female. Same thing with deer. Guys, male deers have antlers, females don't. And females will only select those deers that have kind of the greatest spread, kind of have a nice antler display. And we see it across pretty much a lot of different animal species. Lions, male lions have that beautiful mane. Females usually don't. And females are attracted to the ones that have more of these full, beautiful manes, not kind of like a scruffy looking one. You have a deer once again, peacocks, you have different birds. I'm going to show you a clip at the very end, kind of showing some awesome sexual selection when it comes to birds of paradise, something that came out in planet Earth. So I'll show you guys that at the very end. So once again, it's a female choice. Females are very choosy, so they end up selecting the males, and the males tend to be more extravagant in these animal populations. Now, another agent for evolutionary change is genetic drift. And genetic drift is kind of weird. It's kind of these just random freak chance events that occur that can change a population over time. For example, let's say we have a population of flowers. And notice at the beginning, we have all the genotypes. We have homozygous dominant, we have some heterozygous, we have some homozygous recessive, which are the white. Let's say a group of herbivores comes in and they start eating the plants, and just by some just some freak nature. They end up eating all the ones that are white, all the ones that are pretty much heterozygous as well, so that over a couple generations, we lose the recessive allele. And this is just some chance event that these herbivores came in and ate those particular ones, and now they're gone. And that could definitely change a population over time. Now, when it comes to genetic drift, there's kind of two patterns that we see. We have what we call the founder effect. This is when a small group kind of splinters from a large population, like a small group splinters and starts a new colony somewhere else. And then we have the bottleneck effect. This is where we have a large population, a disaster happens, and it reduces it to only a few. And that few might not represent all the variation that once existed. So we have these. Let's discuss these. Let's discuss the founder effect first. So founder effect, once again, you have a large population, but a little small group splinters off. A couple individuals leave and they start a new colony somewhere else. Now, if that happens, you could imagine that those individuals that leave, that small group, maybe doesn't have all the variation that exists in the larger population. Some rare alleles maybe now are going to be at a high frequency. Other alleles might be missing. It's definitely going to skew the gene pool of the new population. We actually think that all these subpopulations of humans started off by the founder effect. Originally, we think the original population of humans started off in Central South Africa. And that was the original human population when we first started to evolve. And what started to happen, small groups started to splinter off, go into new environments, and slowly started to kind of separate into these subpopulations because of the founder effect. And we kind of could look at this and kind of look at how blood types possibly arose. Distribution of blood types kind of shows a founder effect kind of pattern, where, for example, here we have the distribution of blood type O in blood allele in native populations of the world. It kind of reflects the original settlement. Notice South America, some America up here, that's where we have the huge population of blood type O. So that's possibly where this kind of evolved, and then it started to spread out from there. And we kind of see it with pretty much all blood types as well. We also kind of see it kind of a migration path. Once again, like I mentioned, how originally we have our population in Central South Africa, and then we started to go into a founder effect. Small groups started to splinter, occupy different environments, different habitats, and we started to splinter off, kind of reflecting these traits that we have. Now, the other type of genetic drift pattern we see is the bottleneck effect. This is where we have a large population, something happens, a disaster, like maybe a drought, a fire, a volcano, a hurricane, something happens that wipes out the majority of the population and only a few survive. Guys, those few that survive are not going to represent all the variation that once existed. Alleles could be lost. And now it's not going to be due to fitness. They just get lost because of this random bottleneck effect. And it definitely is going to narrow the gene pool. And here they actually use a bottleneck bottle to kind of show this. Notice how we have yellow, blue, and red marbles. Let's say a disaster happens, only a few survive. And notice what marble we lose, what kind of trait possibly, which is the red one. Now that's going to be lost. It definitely changes the actual population. You're going to see microevolution. We actually think this actually happened to cheetahs. Cheetahs have actually gone to two bottleneck actual effects because all the cheetahs that are alive right now are pretty much like identical twins of each other. There's very little diversity when it comes to cheetahs. We think one bottleneck happened about 10,000 years ago with the Ice Age, and then another one the last 100 years because of poaching and loss of habitat. That the cheetahs that are alive today, they pretty much, once again, are identical twins, very little diversity. And actually, when it comes to bottleneck effect, it's something that now we have to consider when we do conservation. Guys, usually when there is an animal in the endangered species, we try to, start to bring its numbers back up. And at the very beginning, 50 years ago when these programs started up, they didn't really study, they didn't really know too much about the bottleneck effect. So what they would do is they would just grab, a couple of the populations in the wild and reproduce, have those offspring, and then let them back in the wild. But when they do that, they have to be careful that they're not causing, a reduction in that variation because, maybe they're not going to be showing all the variation in that actual population. So now what they try to do is when they go out to the population and they're trying to rise these numbers of these animals on the endangered species, they try to pick a lot of different variations. They pick a lot of different variations, try to mix them, make sure that the offspring also have all this variation that exists in the natural population. So we kind of make sure we're not kind of causing some sort of bottleneck effect. Now, the last one, natural selection. Guys, we've talked about this. This is what Darwin kind of proposed, differential survival and reproduction due to changes in environmental conditions. And guys, the environment, remember, is what's selecting what ends up being an advantage or not. And the climate is always changing. Food sources are changing. New predators can come in, parasites, diseases, toxins, all this can definitely come into a population and definitely change the population. Only those organisms that are going to be fit, that are going to have the ability to be able to survive and reproduce, are going to be able to start to increase their numbers. Now, when we look at the effects of natural selection, we kind of see that it could sometimes drive a population into a different kind of pattern. And there's usually three that we see. We have what we call directional selection, stabilizing selection, disruptive selection. So these are the three types of kind of selection patterns we see when the environment changes. So let's look at this with an example of some mice. So let's say we have a population of mice, and notice we have all variations. We have light colored mice, we have some that are kind of medium colored, and then we have those that are darker colored. And let's say this is the original population. Now, let's say something in the environment happens where suddenly the environment becomes darker. So what's going to happen is those with darker pigment, darker hair color, they're going to be able to survive better. So you're going to see a shift. This is what we call directional selection, where now it's selecting towards one of the genotypes. In this case, maybe it's the homozygous recessive, and it's selecting for those with darker kind of color, and they survive better. Now, it could also go in the other direction. Maybe it's those that are really light colored that get selected for, but it goes in one of the directions. It goes either to this extreme or to this extreme. Or maybe something happens in the environment where we have kind of a splitting of the environment, kind of like maybe some lava rocks. You have a volcano kind of running into a beach area, a sandy beach. So that could split the population, where those that are lightly colored do really well in the beach area. Those that are dark colored maybe do really well with the lava rock. But those that are heterozygous, they don't do so well. Maybe they stick out in both environments and they don't end up surviving really well. So that's diversifying, or sometimes called disruptive selection, where once again, the both extremes are going to be selected for, but the heterozygous, not so good. And then you have stabilizing selection, and that's where the heterozygote actually ends up being selected for. So being in the extremes actually is not good. You stick out in the environment, you don't do really well, but those that are heterozygous do really well. And that's what we call stabilizing selection. So guys, that pretty much ends our notes. We covered 5 agents that cause microevolution. So now we know about natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow, mutation, non-random selection can all alter a population's genetic composition. Guys, natural selection, once again, though, is that primary mechanism of adaptive evolution. Guys, make sure that you study for the Edmodo online quiz coming on Friday. Guys, know there'll be some Zoom meetings on Thursday. No Wednesday afternoon Zoom meeting, but on Thursday there'll be some. So make sure you're checking Edmodo, check the Instagram page as well. And there'll be a podcast dropping very soon as well. So that ends our meeting. But guys, let me see if I could pull up really quickly a video kind of showing this sexual selection. So let me see if I could pull it up, because once again, it's really awesome. I definitely want you guys to check it out. Let's see if I could find it real quick. Hopefully it's this one right here. Oh, let's see. So these are going to be what we call birds of paradise. These are birds in Papua New Guinea. And the birds you're going to see here are all male. They're going to be mostly male birds. And notice how extravagant they're going to be when it comes to their look. So I want you guys to check this out. This was from Planet Earth. They're going to show a female. Hopefully this is the one where they show a female come in. And you're going to see kind of the big differences between the female and the male.
In the great island of New Guinea, there are 42 different species of birds of paradise, each more bizarre than the last.
Notice these are all males. Notice.
That nourishing food can be gathered very quickly. That leaves the male six-plumed bird of paradise with time to concentrate on other matters, like tidying up his display area.
So, he's cleaning up his crib. He wants to have it nice for the ladies.
Everything must be spick and span. All is ready. Very impressive, but no one is watching. The superb bird of paradise.
Check this one out. This one is pretty amazing.
And he has more luck
And notice what the female looks like compared to this male.
to really impress her.
Dude, that's freaky. But notice what the female looks like compared to the male.
It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
Oh, access denied. All that and access denied. That's harsh. So, guys, hopefully, once again, you understood our notes, you wrote them down. Guys, if you have questions, make sure in the next Zoom meeting you bring those questions and we could definitely go over it. Oops, sorry about that. So at this time then, guys, I will now end this lecture. So guys, have an awesome day. Once again, make sure you continue to check Edmodo and Instagram daily. Have an awesome day.